experience with canals in West Virginia. And the irrigation minister looked at him and said, well, with your 200 and our 5,000, we'll have 5,200 years. The point being that a lot of what we think we know really well, guess what? There are other perspectives and other things that they know better than we do. I think that we have to appreciate that partnership is much more than selecting and implementing instrument. It clearly goes into that, but it goes beyond hiring local staff. It goes more towards priority of and within the developing country. Developing norms to identify what makes a good partner. Thinking about what Tim was talking about, if you believe in transparency and accountability and you pick a local partner who does not have those same goals, guess what? You're going to have problems with that. I look at, and by accountability I also mean the information has to be meaningful. It doesn't mean that you reveal that you don't know something. It's got to be worthwhile. I'm going to move a little quickly because I know Tony's got the shepherd's hook out.
You're doing fine.
Knowing the complete picture within a sector. Too often what I've seen both on, when I was at OMB and certainly on the House Appropriations Committee is people would work on one link of the chain without looking at the entire chain. There's no point in building primary schools if you have teachers who are not trained, teachers who are not paid, you don't have a school lunch program, you don't have a textbook program, you don't have a series of places to go. And yet, frequently I will find that people will just focus on, no, we're building the schools. Well, yeah, but if you're trying to look at the net impact of what you're doing, you need to look at those other things as well. I think, frankly, that burden falls entirely on the implementing agencies, meaning AID, MCC, or PEPFAR. You can't go to a grantee or a contractor and expect them to paint the full picture. You really have to, that really is the government's responsibility. I think you need to be explicit about the beneficiaries and how they benefit. The MCC has put up on its website economic rates of return for every project. They're working on doing the beneficiary analysis. I think there's a ton more work and of intellectual capital and rigor that ought to be applied to this topic. It's what Congress wants to see. You know, one reason for the earmarks, and I never tire of saying this, is, you know, if you're going to propose a generality for an unknown country to do an unspecified number of things with unknown beneficiaries versus what a senator is hearing about from, I can do this in water, I can do that in education, guess what wins? And I think too frequently people have fallen back on executive privilege without appreciating that there is, in fact, a third way, which is that if you're quite explicit about what you want to do, risk noted, and you can lay out a good operational business plan at a level of granularity and specificity, that's the most effective way of fighting an earmark. You know, why is it that people want to put $200 million or more into something like water? It's real, it's tangible, it's a benefit. Why do they say so much for tropical forestry or other things? And I think that's a problem that needs to be confronted head on. Monitoring and evaluation. Again, the MCC built this into the design of the project. You can't, after the fact, send a group of folks out and hope to have a meaningful evaluation of what goes on. What did you expect to have happen? What's the counterfactual? What's the database? Who's doing it? How do you get there? Those are all important things that I think are absolutely relevant to explaining why we do development assistance, and yet it becomes an afterthought. You have to distinguish, is this something that's useful for programmers within an agency to understand what worked or didn't work? Is it useful for portfolio analysis? You want to put more here, less there? Or is it useful to Congress and the executive branch? I'd submit it's all of the above. And frankly, I think that's what a lot of the QDDR and the PSD are about. Transparency, providing a frame of reference, amending and revising that frame of reference in discussion with partners. You know, I think Rich Armitage one time in testimony said, you know, no good plan survives first contact with the enemy. I think that's absolutely true. Dwight Eisenhower said it's not the plan that's important, it's the planning process. I think these are things that have to be explored and laid out, and again, I think the burden is going to fall on AID, MCC, PEPFAR, and whatever else. Pragmatism, I think there are far too many differing worldviews for only one approach to development, and in fact, I lived in Turkey when my father was an aid contractor, and I can remember back in the 60s, that was sort of infrastructure, and people talked about takeoff, and then it became basic human needs, and then it became policies, and then it became institution building, and then it became gap-filling analysis. Well, guess what? They're all right. And they're all sort of meaningless unless you can really talk the specifics. I'm going to race through to the end and just say that I think going forward, the Obama administration is just now starting to come together. I think that when Secretary Clinton on Monday night said something, a passing reference to OMB and the tough job that they had, I thought, thank God I'm not there, because it really is going to be tough. You look at the federal deficit going forward, and the deficit, just the deficit, not federal spending, the deficit is going to be 10 or 11% of GDP. Those are going to be frightening numbers, I think, for the Congress when they come back. And I think what that means is there's going to be huge scrutiny put on development assistance and foreign aid in general. You always get it even in good times. You're really going to get it now. And I think part of the answer to that is, well, what are we getting? Why are we doing this? Let's explain it. Let's be candid. Let's talk about what didn't work, because then you can talk about what does work. My final point is I think we spend too much time on focusing on the what's broken and not on what works. There are a lot of things that do work, and so when people look at assistance in the context of Iraq or Afghanistan, Pakistan, well, that's important, and you want to get that part of it right, and you want to do it right. But I will also say, let's look at what's going right in Latin America, in Africa, and other parts of the world. And there are a lot of really good things going on for which you are all responsible, and with that, I'll stop.
Well, I think my three colleagues really lived up to expectations in terms of giving you a lot from their own experience, and I think perhaps, Rodney summed it up very best with that last remark, that in a context where people are thinking about reform, looking at trying to make the system work better, that understanding and thinking about how to adapt things that really do work amidst many other things with which we're all less than fully satisfied is a really important thing to do. We've got a great turnout, and what I'd like to do is invite you to come up to either microphone.
I'm sorry, Steve Mosey. Perhaps
Well known to us all.
Perhaps it's coming in the context of an expectation that most of what you discussed in terms of past experience, in terms of a rational approach to contracting or different instruments, is perhaps passé, and the administration is trying to find, is there a better way beyond all of that? Is there a more political expedient way? Is there an absolutely lower cost way? Is there a political way to bypass most of what the development community has achieved in the past? Not necessarily saying it's wrong, but has it achieved enough? And I'm interested in your perspective on how do you get across the very extraordinary, thoughtful, empirically based, really, process and rational consideration that you just presented to us, to those who are very much in doubt about what all that rational process has achieved in the past. They're looking for other instruments, multilateral trusts, capital investment, joint venture activities, a whole slew of new multilateral funds that are outside the federal procurement process once you transfer the money, et cetera, et cetera. So on that side. Also, I'd argue that they're simply saying that any overhead costs, any indirect cost, no matter how rational or you define it, is too much, that it's not politically a value added that can be given in order to ensure local leadership, local ownership. So those are the challenges I'd put to you. How do you get across your wonderful presentations to those who seem to be having a predilection toward a very different worldview?
But your question's great, and I wish I had a magic answer to say, let's do this or let's do that. There are things